Today, we want to attend to a subject matter that has been not only important, but fundamentally important to our lives as human beings. We want to take a little look into the discussion that has been in the peace studies tradition, the technicity of peace studies that tells us the different skills, the different technical domain to deploy and sustain if we have to talk about peace. We want to differ from that tradition, what I'm calling the technicity tradition. And we see this in Johann Galtung's work that takes us more into skills, into domains with which we can deploy in the search for peace. We want to shift from that and go more into humanity, go more into orienting ourselves with the higher ideals, what we are calling the foundational reality of what makes us human beings. Not human beings in their particular sense that they are countable, 1, 2, 3 human beings, but human beings as a family, what we're calling humanity. And so we want to build our idea about peace, our idea about collaborative relationship from this domain and shifting from technicity. And to build on, our subject matter today picks from a debate between two personalities in the philosophical traditions. The idea of I exist and the idea of I am in a dying. Our thesis is to contest and suggest that the idea of I exist is futile. And more, we emphasize the authentic reality of I am in a dying. And as we go on, we are going to see these two debates and the scholars that actually take us through this debate. And as we said, we are going deeper beyond technicity to the question of humanity that takes us to the higher ideals of reality, that takes us to attitude, orientation of how we can behave as humanity for purposes of peace. And that means we are going to touch a little more the religious documents, and here we are dealing with the Bible, the biblical text, and how that transforms us or journeys us through to our idea of the higher ideals of humanity. Building on the biblical text, and we would wish to cite Quran too, Romans chapter 12 verse 2 tells us that we should not conform to this world, but be transformed by renewing our minds and approve what is the will of God. Matthew chapter 5 verse 9 tells us that blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. From these two, we gather here with a different and yet a specific mission. And our mission is for peace, but with a religious and not a world's frame, for purposes of transiting from the idea of technicity in building peace to the idea of humanity that takes us through the processing of our religious attributes as the higher reality. This religious frame of peace building has therefore a different standard. The Bible and Quran gives us this central reorienting attitude and higher ideals of the reality of being human to help us understand how, as humanity, we can build peace. Accordingly, our task is not to unsettle the worldly technicity, but a complex appreciation of the higher ideals of being human or humanity built on our religious domain as humanity or humans. It is this divine, this spirituality, this state of being that enhances a certain attitude among us, the religious, among us, you and I as well, an attitude of divine responsibility and obligation that frames our social world and practices. Today, as our thesis, we reread peace building from this point, framing our approach to peace building beyond, although not outside, the secular to the divine, and therefore motivated by the divine inspiration and instructions from the holy books, and religious significations arising from scholarship and literature. For the purpose of this engagement, we reread René Descartes' Cogito ergo sum, I think or I doubt, therefore I am, in his book Discourse on Method, first published in 1637, and I'm reading from the current works as republished in 2004. And this Cogito ergo sum is a summary about a Cartesian rationality that suggests that a proof to human life, proof to human knowledge, is about certainty of existence and the qualitative leap that with which we can know certainly what we think we know. We want to say that this has been the basis of the current technicity in the building of peace. And we want to shift from that into a little more fundamental reality of humanity. And this is the reality of death. Death as a defining moment of certainty and reality. And we pick this from the works of Martin Heidegger's Sum Moribundus, I am in dying. The subject of death is a very interesting area, and this is not to cause commotion here, but to help us to understand the foundation of authentic peace building, built on the higher ideals of humanity and the spiritual aspect of humanity. From a religious point and picking from the concept of Christian and Muslim idea of death as liberation to eternity, we pick on Martin Heidegger's Sum Moribundus, which we said is a Latin version of the English word, I am in dying. And we reread as well alongside biblical texts and the Quran if required to show the authenticity of the idea of Sum Moribundus, I am in dying, as opposed to I exist. To elaborate on this, we use the theoretical works of Martin Buber in his book, Ich Hundu, I and Thou, stroke I and It, written in 1923. To think through his central vocabularies of I, it, and I, thou, that connects pretty much with the idea of Sum Moribundus as opposed to Cogito ergo sum, or I think, therefore I am. In the next section, we look at the social world of René Descartes and his idea of I think, therefore I am. Why we are going into that is to contest this idea of I exist, from which the technicity of peace building has been built as contestable, as unreal, and short of the core concept of humanity. Our reading is from René Descartes. 1637 is the original works, but we are taking the reading from the reprinted version of 2004. The title is Discourse on Method, translated by John Vage in London. And what is the method that Descartes deploys? Descartes argues that it is important to provide a certain foundation for knowledge about reality. To build on this, he takes on doubt as a method, doubting everything there is, including doubting God. Finally, he realizes that that which doubts or thinks should be alive or present in order to doubt or to think. And he suggests that you cannot not be and yet doubt or think. So, he gives us the famous expression, cogito ergo sum, which is Latin for the English version, I think, therefore I am. The idea of thinking, or precisely translated as doubting, proved in the version of Descartes one's existence, because you cannot doubt and yet not be. For he who doubts must first be in existence before he doubts. And therefore, I think shows the idea of existence, which is I am. And that to Descartes was important evidence that no ground of doubt could be alleged, because he who thinks must of course exist. And that became the first principle of reality according to René Descartes. What things, he argues, exist? So, it is not correct that what things does not exist at the very time of doubting or thinking. In other words, we cannot doubt our existence while we doubt. So, we can also say, ego dubito, ego cogito, cogito ego sum. I doubt, I think. Since I think, I therefore exist. In this sense, one who is thinking is not just a thinking thing, but exists. That means we need to think a little bit about what this I think, therefore I am, is. Mere cogito ego, which is I think, is actually synonymous with I think something, or the idea of he thinks, or she thinks, or I think. And so it seeks to shift to present continuous, beyond I think to I am thinking. I am thinking, therefore, reroutes the idea of active presence, so that when one says, I am thinking, it is a manifestation of I exist. But which one is a better terminology here in the interpretation of Descartes? Is it the idea of I exist or the idea of I am? Since existence is core to Descartes' cogito ergo sum, it means the cogito ergo sum is I am thinking, therefore I exist. In other words, one cannot doubt if one does not think, and one cannot think if one doubts, if one does not exist. So it means I doubt, and therefore I think, and I exist. So the claim of the only certainty in one's reality is one's existence. Doubt or thinking becomes a method of arriving to this existence, or to this I exist. Meaning, The first principle of knowing or knowledge is not doubting or thinking, but the idea of I exist or existing. 4. One first has to exist before he begins to doubt. So the core of cogito ergo sum is actually not I am, but I exist. In a sense, and briefly so, what René Descartes emphatically states is that I am not specifically talking about I am, but basically about I exist. So that then cogito ergo sum implies I think or I doubt, therefore I exist. The mainstream translation of ergo sum as I am now becomes problematic. That the emphasis of Descartes was not I am in a generic sense, but ergo sum implied basically the emphasis on I exist. And we want to follow this question of existence by asking a critical question. In what sense is authentic existence? That is the primary question. In what sense is authentic existence? To answer this question, we want to turn to Martin Heidegger. Martin Heidegger constructs an interesting concept, borrowed from Latin, sum moribundus, I am in dying. In other words, Heidegger begins to project the issue of authentic existence more towards dying. That the authentic existence of humanity is not I exist as such, but I exist towards the reality of dying. And to him, that is authentic existence, and we want to see why. And our text here is Martin Heidegger, Being and Time, first published in 1962 and translated by John Macquarie and Edward Robinson. Heidegger argues, unlike Descartes, that moribundus, dying, gives sense to the sum which is existence, so that what is certain as reality is not existence, but dying. And so he said, sum moribundus, I am in dying. Dying becomes the most original form of existence. It is in this sense that Baruch Spinoza, in his book Ethics, argues that free men should think of nothing less than death, because wisdom in the modern era is focused on contemplation about the life of existing, of the life of now, the life of I am, the life of a presence, which is Cartesian, the idea of I exist, so I have to enjoy myself. And not about death. And as a result, we live in a life of now, a life of power seeking, glory seeking, and disregard of each other. Dying in the mind of Heidegger involves an attitude of where are we going and where shall we be? To him, authentic existence, therefore, is one that comes from somewhere and will go somewhere. This is the idea of home. In other words, where we are is not home but placeholder. A placeholder meaning for now we are, but it's not perpetually the case. But where we will be is the authentic home. One without a home behaves like an animal without purpose. Home gives purpose and therefore a certain attitude of behaving. That is why Heidegger argues that dying is more authentic than existence. And therefore, unlike existence, Dying is the first principle of reality. To build this argument, Heidegger crafts some vocabularies. Example, being towards death, which is to him authentic. Accordingly, Heidegger establishes an ontology of what it means to be or to exist, and formed a triad of death, authentic existence, and time, which is the idea of mortality and immortality or eternity. In what sense does dying reorient us, therefore? Heidegger suggests dying gives us a certain attitude about life, living and our relations as humans. And therefore it shifts us from the everyday as a they self or does man, as people of the world, to thyself, which is divine, as people of purpose. In a sense, all being alongside the things with which we concern ourselves will fail us, because all humans die alone. And this is the concept of loneliness of dying. And alone, without our cars, without our children, without our houses, without our money, and of course without Paimol, and on as one may add. When my consciousness therefore becomes aware of dying, it helps us to see the world and other humans in a different light and relate in a particular way. In another sense, we learn life from death and learn death from life. Dying, therefore, marks the ultimate meaning of human existence and being itself, marking a path to a life of authenticity, what we call a life of eternity. It is in this sense that the book of Ecclesiastes observes, vanity of vanities, chapter 1, verse 1 to 4. All are from dust, and to dust all return, chapter 3, 19 to 20. Seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me, all is vanity, chapter 2, verse 18. What is the significance of sum moribundus? I am in dying. To be wise, humans must first learn to number their days. This is Heidegger's conception of being towards death. Disappointment, disgust, and hatred overcomes only those who hoped for too much from life and the idea of the now, the current, the existence of today. Having the expectation of a permanence or state of permanence leads us, like it led the writer of Ecclesiastes, to nihilistic despair and hatred of life and others. Once we reorient ourselves to one's finitude, in other words, end, one finds enjoyment in all the toil under the sun, the few days of his life that God has given him. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 18. Consequently, this new attitude creates a different and a religious state of relationship and peaceful coexistence. To enhance this relation, we use the theoretical works of Martin Buber's I and thou relation. And we bring Martin I and thou relation as a result of the realization and our attitude towards the question of authentic I am in dying, as opposed to I am to mean existence. And when I have this attitude towards I am in dying, how do we then relate as humans? Martin Heidegger does not take us into this detail. And so we want to bring in the details from Martin Buber to build this relation among humans. And our reading is taken from Martin Buber, first published in 1923 and republished in 1958. The title is I and Thou, translated by Ronald Gregory Smith. The context of Martin Buber's Ich Hundu, or I, Thou, in relation to Sum Moribundus, which is I am in dying. Martin Buber underscores the motivation for human attitude and relationships. He realizes that his ethics or morality is not science or technocratic, but rather centered on two religious realities, which is dying and eternity. And eternity is only possible for the Christians after talking about resurrection. It is this reality that connects us to God as the source or originator of life and death and eternity. Otherwise, if we were to limit our reality to only life, then life would be an ease without tending towards anything else, and we would be stuck in the worldly and treat each other as worldly or things in the world. The motivation of an authentic relationship of I-thou is the idea of dying and resurrecting, for which we are towards it, and therefore conscious of the need to prepare ourselves towards it by taking on the characteristics of God of eternity, in order that dying does not terminate our existence or being. It is this that inspired his writing of I, Thou, or in Latin, Ich und in 1923. I have the original copy with me. In this I-thou relationship, Buber argues that God is the eternal thou who sustains the I-thou relation. Here, there is a unity with God, and one is in communion with God. This eternal relationship with God beyond existence and to dying is a universal one. So, when one has an I-thou relation with God, then he is motivated by his relationship with God to relate with other humans in the same way, or guided by it. Martin Buber's I-thou relation builds on Heidegger's idea of sum moribundus as a source of authentic reality and self-consciousness to build a truly human peaceful relation while awaiting dying. His schema is to enhance human dialogue with each other and with the infinite God. This is by adopting an authentic attitude of I-thou as opposed to I-it. The I-thou is a relation of subject to subject, human to human, while I-it is a relation of a human who thinks the other is an object, what we are calling the it. In a sense, thingifying the other. The other is a thing. The other is objectified because the other is thought as an object. In the I-thou relationship, human beings shift to human persons who are aware of each other as having a unity of being as humans or humanity. I-thou is a relationship of mutuality and reciprocity, while I-it is a relationship of separateness and detachment, as a subject relating with the other as an object in a way of what we call thingifying or thinging or thingsification. Converting the subject to subject relationship, which is I-thou, is a mode of I and the other as brothers keepers or neighbors or friends or humans. It is at that point that we can talk about love, we can talk about care, we can talk about unity, we can talk about sensitivity, we can talk about sensibility. And all these are attributes of us relating as subject to subject. And therefore, Martin Buber observes that the I-thou relation is a direct relationship of subject to subject, which is not mediated by any other intention or exploitation. Love, care, empathy, respect, and many others is this fruit that comes as a result of a relation between I and the thou. In the I-thou relation, the subjects do not perceive each other as objects, but perceive each other as humanity. In the I-thou relation, the I is unified with the thou. But in this, God is actually at the center, connecting the I and the thou as a thou with a capital T. The I-thou relationship is a relationship of shared humanity. And as a result, Buber argues that I without thou is less complete. Unless the thou is, I is not. Unless the I is, thou is not. It is this sense of shared humanity that makes us each complete. We then want to say here, as we earlier on argued from the beginning, that relationship building is much more pronounced and profound than the technicity, the skills that we deploy to build peace. Peace is not a skill. Peace is a relationship. Peace is an attitude. But this attitude must be built on a secure foundation. And as we saw, René Descartes' idea of I exist, I am, which implies I exist, is not authentic. Because when we are thinking towards the notion of I exist, then this is where the core problem is. I exist in the present, I exist in the now, and because I exist in the present, I must accumulate those items, those dimensions that keep my existence. And this is the reason why we can talk about corruption, we can talk about mass killings, we can talk about all the vices we can talk about. And it is this attention to the problems of I exist in the sense of the now that we see from René Descartes, that Martin Heidegger seeks to establish a more authentic reality. And he realizes that I exist as an attention to now is the core problem of human vices. And he shifts us towards the idea and attention to dying, that the reality of humanity is not existence. The reality of humanity is tending towards death. And death is not a finality, it's not the final state. It's simply locating us to a time zone and to a space corner that is simply eternal. So that dying is not a disaster. Dying is a transition to a more authentic life. And Heidegger then begins to realize that when we have an attitude that looks and thinks and agrees and accepts and knows that we are tending towards death, then the presence, the existence, the current is not important. And one who knows is tending towards death has a different lifestyle, has a different attitude, and relates differently with the others because he must prepare himself to this finality, to this new transition to eternity through the process of dying. And from a Christian perspective, we are told that it is a reward of how you lived your life here. Now, built on this new framework, this new theoretical framework, and understanding human authenticity, in understanding human reality, we begin to see that the source origin of building peace, building authentic peace, is not the technical attributes in the I exist, but more towards the idea and attitude of I am in dying. Thank you.